So,
Okay, so we have to be careful what we say now because we are being recorded. Would you like to hold questions until the end and let people type them in the chat window?
yeah, if you don't care,
And
can
that's the
you
way we
see my
usually do
screen,
it.
Richard?
Yes, we can see your screen
Okay.
just fine. We're doing Soils 101 apparently.
Yep. We're going to go
Okay.
through testing.
All right. So if you have any questions, if you want to remember them, just type them in the chat window and we will go over those at the end because we won't let Lucas go until he answers all of them.
That's fine. I go to bed at 7:30, so we're going to see how this goes.
I thought that was your daughter.
We all go to bed at the same time.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, rush on through.
Well, I appreciate the invite from Patty to come speak to y'all tonight. We're going to go through the basics of soil testing. We're going to try to look at pH a little bit, and we're going to be looking about some issues that may happen with over fertilization. And I'm going to tell some stories about what I do. I'm actually an extension agent with Wilson County. Most of my work is with horticulture, so I run the Master Gardener program, and I do a lot of the soil testing. I also farm. Last week, farming was not enjoyable. I did not enjoy farming. So I questioned why I had cattle every day on Facebook. And I looked up other hobbies such as stamp collecting. I was looking for other hobbies in the wintertime that would be more enjoyable than me feeding my cows in the wintertime. And we raise Angus cattle and we also raise Dorset sheep. So Dorset are a white face wool breed. So we sell wool and we sell the meat and we also sell live lambs. So we're farmers, but it's kind of a hobby farm that got out of hand. We have probably 50 sheep now, and they're very fertile. I also have a baby. So my daughter was born last year, right before the world shut down. So she has lived most of her life in a bubble in my house. So we farm. One of the things that we farm is garlic. We were trying to find some of the niche crops that most people weren't actually farming around the area. So that's why we kind of got hung up on lamb and garlic. That's my best friend. His name's Jason Reeves, and he's also a garden speaker. But the problem with these kids today is they're always on their phones. So I'm always telling Jason, put his phone up and get back to work. We're going to kind of jump into some basics of soils. I had quite a few college classes on soils. A lot of that did not prepare me for what I actually do for my everyday job. So a lot of people in Middle Tennessee, they'll say, I've got clay. What do I do? And I'll say, well, you're dealing with like 99% of the other population in our county. We all kind of have that clay-based type soil. We're going to be going through some of the soil testing. We're going to be looking at also some basic fertilizer requirements for some basic crops in Tennessee. So they're all going to be different. And these were just some of the places that I work with in Wilson County because we have a couple of peach orchards I work exclusively with, and they also do blueberries and some other things on the side. Some of y'all, it pops up, admit Sheila Brown. Will y'all be clicking admit on those, Richard?
Yeah, you
Okay.
don't worry about that. We'll take
Okay.
care of all that.
Good. Y'all have probably seen this. If you had a science class at some point from 8th grade biology on, you saw this soil triangle. And what we mostly have in Middle Tennessee is going to be a mix of silt and clay. If we were going next to the Mississippi River, we're going to have a lot more sand. For the most part, where I'm at in Wilson County and most of Davidson County, we don't have a lot of sand to begin with, unless it was actually added there by somebody else. But what we actually have are all these different types of soil, and it's based upon the percentage of clay, it's based upon the percentage of silt, and it's based upon the percentage of sand. So you can kind of look at this soil triangle that we call it. And if you were to go, 70% clay and 30% silt, it's still considered clay based upon that triangle. And you can Google this soil triangle and find plenty of different options of it online that are probably a lot more cleaned up other than this. This is from USDA and NRCS. But if we kind of get a little bit more complicated and we say, I've got 70% silt, and I have 20% sand, then I have the other 10% clay. It kind of tells me what type of soil that I actually have. And when we get into the classifications of soil, There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of types of soil that we can call. So each little geographical region that we have in our state kind of has a little soil named after it. And it could be completely different 100 feet over on your property or your neighbor's property. Why do we soil test to begin with? We want fertilizer efficiency. The one issue that we have, and I grew up this way. My mother will put the same amount of fertilizer on her corn, on her beans every year. Does not matter what's in the ground to begin with. She has no clue what's in the ground. What happens to that excess fertilizer? It could be used up by the plants. It could run off into streams and actually cause some issues with some aquatic vegetation. So if we have a lot of excess phosphorus, a lot of potassium, and it goes into some of our streams, we're going to have a lot of algal growth. What does that do to the oxygen level in the water? It takes it down. So what does that do to the aquatic life? Stresses them out. So if we just actually use the right amount of fertilizer at the right amount of time, we're not going to have a lot of this excess problems with our fertility. We also have more balanced nutrient levels of crops. We don't guess on what we're actually going to apply. Most gardeners, 50, 60 years ago, they were just kind of throwing it out the same way. They always used, most farmers, 50, 60 years ago, used 6, 12, 12. Didn't matter if they needed the phosphorus or potassium, they still put it on the ground. What does clay do? It holds on to phosphorus and potassium. Most of the soil tests that come across my desk need no phosphorus, need no potassium. But yet, a lot of these gardeners are still putting phosphorus and potassium, phosphorus and potassium, phosphorus and potassium. Why? And I'm not sure if it's just because that's what their parents did, that's what their parents did, and that's what their parents did. When we kind of get into the we're also going to lose money for the most part. If you're just constantly using the same type of fertilizers out there, you're wasting money to begin with. Most of the soils that we have, like I said, are clay. They have a small pore space. That small pore space really does a great job of holding fertility in the soil. People really get mad when they say, I can't grow anything in this clay. Most of the soil tests that have come across my desk that were rough looking clay have been extremely high in phosphorus, high in potassium, high in calcium, high in sulfur, iron, zinc, boron. They are really rich soils. What's the issue? That pore space is small and they hold water too much. That's where we're having some issues with fruit trees. We'll have issues with vegetable crops and things like that. People call and they'll say, I've got plants dying in my yard. I need a soil test. A soil test does not test for diseases. We can't do that at the university. There are some universities that can check for some of those things, but they do charge a very nice price for that. When we talk about soil testing at the university level, all we are talking about is checking for nutrients. We can check for the main ones, the micronutrients and the macronutrients. So I'm going to go through those in a little bit later. When do we actually test our soil? Fall is the best time to do it. And the only reason why is a lot of times, depending on your pH, it may ask you to put some lime down. Lime can take 2 years to work, especially if you use a pelletized lime. If you use a powdered lime, it will take less time than that. But pH does not change quickly. I think sometimes people will call and they'll say, I'm going to plant some blueberries next week. How can I change my soil? And I'll say, well, you should have done that last year. It takes a year to really get your soil prepped right in order to grow certain plants. If you're going to grow a finicky plant like a blueberry, you should have started your work last year and not bought any plants until this year. How often should we begin to test these places? We should test lawns and gardens every 3 years. Some of our high value crops, we have some pretty high value crops. Some farmers rely on that income. I work with 2 peach orchards in our county, and they're going to probably be testing their lots every year just to make sure that they're putting the right amount out. For people who are row cropping, it's every 2 to 3 years. And it doesn't need to be tested every year. It's just because we have so much clay, it holds on to so much nutrients. The only thing it doesn't hold on to is nitrogen. Nitrogen leaches away so quickly from our soils. How should we actually test our soil? And this kind of depends on the situation that you have. If you have raised bed boxes that you're growing something in, or if you have actually dirt, soil, If you have a small plot that you're going to put a butterfly garden in, you're only going to take the soil samples from that plot. We'll say it's 30 by 30. You're going to go in that area that's 30 by 30 and pull 8 to 10 different plugs of soil that are an inch wide by 6 inches deep. You're going to put all 8 or 10 of those plugs into one bag, and you can bring them to me. You can take them to the Soil Pest and Plant Center in Nashville. You can use a shovel. We also have soil probes. Most extension offices have soil probes where it basically goes into the soil, pulls out a plug, and you put all those plugs into one bucket and bring it in. You can also use a shovel and just go straight down, and you select the one strip of land of soil, remove all the rocks, remove the organic matter, the trash. You're wanting to actually test the dirt, the brown, the clay that's actually there. If it's high bark, if it's high leaf matter, leaf mold, it's not going to actually come out right. You can do different tests for that, but we're just talking about soil. If we were testing things that had high porosity in it, such as leaf mold or bark or old sawdust or something like that, that's a completely different test. There should be no significant area. If it's extremely rocky or pasture, keep it in the area. If it's shady versus sunny, if it's hilly versus flat. Um, so if you had a 30 by 30 butterfly garden, half of it's extremely flat and the other half is on a hill, theoretically, that's going to be two different types of soil. You probably need to do two different types of tests because the soil is going to be completely different at the bottom of the hill as opposed to what's on the side. So this is a now, I'll be honest, I don't test my soils as often as I should. And I felt like I threw my mother under the bus earlier. And I do the same thing sometimes, like my mother. I just go out there and fertilize when I feel like I need to sometimes. Now, I need to do a better job on testing. This was a pasture that we had a couple of years ago. So we went through for our sheep, and you can kind of see our Pyrenees right there. We went through it and tested it. This soil has had absolutely nothing done to it in years. I'm probably going to guess 10 or 15 years. Some farmers years ago, before we moved to it, used to pull hay off of it. And that was really about all that they did. And I'll show you the soil test from this beautiful strip of land right here that's had absolutely nothing in just a couple of minutes. Just to show you again real quickly, if you were to use a shovel, you may just kind of go through and get those little bitty plugs, an inch by 6 inches. And if you don't have a soil probe, you can use a shovel and it works out just as well. If you are testing a large plot of land, we'll say you're going to make a giant butterfly garden, each test needs to be at least less than 10 acres. So if you've got a plot of land that's 50 acres, theoretically, that's going to be 5 different tests, and you just kind of make a map out. But for the most part, most soil samples that come across my desk are plots of land that are actually smaller than 10 acres. But if there's somebody watching and they have a huge plot of land they're wanting to work on, make sure it's less than 10 acres per sample. So put all those 8 to 10 different samples in a single bucket. Make sure you don't pick a week like this week to try to pull soil. You're going to be pulling up mud. All this dirt, all this soil actually goes into a cardboard box. It's not going to do well in a cardboard box long. You may have to wait a couple of weeks because when you pull a soil of sample, when it's really wet and you allow it to dry, it becomes hard as a rock. And in my office, I have to take a hammer and try to bust it up myself and to make it powder. Don't use a galvanized bucket. There is actually minerals on a galvanized bucket, and that can mess up your soil sample. Mix all the soil together, remove all the rocks, remove all the debris. And for each soil test, you only need 1 cup of dry matter. And 1 cup, we're talking, a little bitty box. It's about 3 inches by 3 inches. That will kind of tell everything that they need to know about the soil. That'll tell the pH and then all the different nutrients. And you can pay extra to have them do some micronutrient test on some. If you're not around my county and you want to send it to somebody else, you can send it to the Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville, and they can go through and test it for you. There is a fee. It's 15. It starts at 15. If you want to get really technical and to get into a lot of these micronutrients, it goes up from there. But this is actually the website for the Soil Pest and Plant Center. It's ag.tennessee.edu/SPP, which is Soil Plant Pest. This is also there's some great people up there. There's some great pathologists if you have diseases. There's some great entomologists, Dr. Frank Hale. that I work a lot with up there. And we have some great diagnosticians up there who are really good at identifying mushrooms and things. So I don't know if you know what an extension agent does. My job is diseases, bugs. People will call and they'll say, I found these mushrooms in my yard. Can I eat them? And I'll say, all mushrooms are edible at least once. And that usually they don't laugh after that. But I get a lot of these random questions like that deals with plants. It doesn't really matter what it is. They all kind of fall on me. So once you have pulled all your soil and you're going to actually do a soil test, you fill out this sheet right here. And what you need to determine is what you're actually testing for. And it's going to be based upon what you're going to plant in that area. So you can see where it says planting options right there. It says crop 1, crop 2, crop 3, crop 4. Well, on the next page, you'll actually see what you're going to be growing. If it's perennials, if it's annuals, I don't know if y'all can see that or not, Richard, but you can kind of see they're going to be asking. On my screen, it looks a little bit different. I see everybody's, I think, camera screens over here. Hopefully y'all can see most of my PowerPoint slide.
It's coming through pretty good.
Okay, good. A little bit small on my screen, but it just depends on what you're going to grow. Now, an acid-loving shrub would be some of the azaleas. A non-acid-loving shrub would be something like, pretty much everything else other than an azalea or a rhododendron type shrub. They're the only ones that kind of really prefer a really low pH. But if you're going to be planting annuals for some type, if you're going to be planting Asclepias species, there are some that are annuals types and there are some that are perennial types. So make sure you kind of select the right ones on there. So that's what they're wanting to know, what you're going to grow, so they can actually test the soil for that, because the test will tell you how much to add, because each plant requires something completely different. I'm going to skip that. This is mostly for pasture type work for people who are doing silage. And also, if you were testing and you had a small plot of land and you were testing for blueberries, you were going to plant some blackberries, grapes, whatever the case may be, we can actually tell you how to amend the soil just for those, because it's difficult to grow some of these fruits right beside each other, because a blueberry requires a pH of about 4.8 to 5.2. An apple wants it about 6.5 to 7. They don't grow right next to each other. Well, most small homeowners, they plant them all together, and usually some of them survive and some of them just kind of go by the wayside. So kind of going back to that soil test, that beautiful pasture with my sheep and my 2 Pyrenees dogs, nobody has fertilized it in years. It was really high clay. It's about 8 or 10 acres is the size of that field. So I took eight soil samples from it. It had a pH value of 5.74. And then it says next to it, a buffer value. A buffer value basically goes from 7 to 8, and that shows the resistance to change. So basically that soil can be changed. So anywhere from 7 to 8, my soil can be changed. So you can see where we're actually testing for all the nutrient. Move that now. All the nutrients now. The phosphorus, the potassium, the calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, manganese, boron, and sodium. You see these numbers and they mean absolutely nothing to you. It says 217V. That V means very high. Nobody has done anything with this land in probably 10 or 15 years other than cutting some hay. Potassium, 102, that's pounds per acre. M means moderate. We probably don't need any potassium. Calcium, 2,315 pounds. That's S means sufficient. Magnesium, 181 pounds. Sufficient. Zinc, 1.5 pounds. Sufficient. Iron, sufficient. Boron, everything is sufficient. So I think sometimes we have issues with people just over fertilizing, and I'm guilty of this also. We just think in the back of our heads, we've got to be fertilizing something. How do you know what to fertilize with without actually testing the soil? So for this, it gave some recommendations at the bottom. You can kind of see it says cool season grass pasture. Most of my pastures were actually fescues. Nitrogen, 60 to 120 pounds per acre. The phosphorus, because I had a very high phosphorus level in my pasture, 0. And the potash, I just needed some, because once I really start pushing that fescue growth, I'm going to actually start using up some of that potash that's already listed on the soil test sample. But this, I'm just kind of showing you this soil I can't really think of anything being done with it in years. And it was so fertile. There were a few cows on it at some times, but it had probably been 10 years since some cows were actually on it. And we know the manure and things like that's really great for plants, but that's a really good soil. High clay, really fertile soil. This was another one in our area. This is one of the peach orchards that I work with in our county. You can kind of see their soil pH was 7.06, which is great for peaches. Their phosphorus H, that means high. Potassium 295, H means high. And everything else across the board was sufficient. And it kind of gave because fruit that develops, a stone, cherries, peaches, nectarines, and plums, they're going to require quite a bit of phosphorus and potash. You can kind of see at the bottom, it talks about the recommendations. So 30 pounds of phosphorus and 30 pounds of phosphate per acre. So kind of looking at some of these soil tests, whenever you get them back, you'll see all these numbers and you're like, that means absolutely nothing to me. So low phosphorus generally is 0 to 18 pounds and potassium is 0 to 90 pounds. Now plants take up potassium in different forms. So if you go buy a bag of potassium, potash, it's going to probably be, K2O5 or something like that. But you can get some organic type forms of potassium. And I'm going to hit on one of the last slides is some of the organic fertilizers that we're seeing on the market today and their numbers of how much phosphorus, how much potassium, and how much nitrogen is actually in them. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that one too right there. So kind of talking about pH for just a few minutes. pH is extremely important and it does not change easily. Like I said earlier, if we had a pH that was 8 on a soil sample and we were trying to grow blueberries, which are 4.8 to 5.2, they are not going to grow. And I tell people, please find another hobby, grow something else, anything other than a blueberry. The number one reason why blueberries fail is the pH is off. A lot of these native deciduous type azaleas, they need a pH of like 5. Most of our soils are 5.7, 5.8, 5.9. They do all right, but we still need to drop it some more. Now, what does the pH actually have to do? It has to do with the amount of fertility in that soil of what's available, because it can actually lock up. So, why do blueberries like a low pH? Why do some of these native deciduous azaleas like a low pH? Because the aluminum is available in the soil at that range. When you get up to 7, the pH is locked up in the soil. The pH locks up the aluminum in the soil, but when you start dropping that pH, the aluminum starts to be released. You can actually see on this chart of what nutrients are actually available at different pHs. Like boron is not available at 7, but when you drop it or kind of go up to 8, it's available again. It's such a finicky player sometimes. pH really does matter. Even though we get a soil test back and it says really high aluminum, and our plants need high aluminum, but the pH is off. They're not able to use that aluminum that's actually in the soil. So the buffer value, and I mentioned this earlier, your soil's resistance to change runs about 7 to 8. So the easiest soils to change are closer to 8, and the hardest are closer to 7. Above 8.5, which I have never seen in my years of dealing with soil testing, is considered sodic or really salty. I highly doubt we got any in Middle Tennessee. Some of the pH sensitive plants, blueberries, these azaleas, rhododendrons, magnolias like a low pH, camellias, blue hydrangeas, if you're trying to keep them blue, it's all based upon the aluminum. High pH plants, most of my work is with vegetable people. So asparagus, cabbage, carrots, lettuce, spinach, and a lot of the green type plants, kale, bok choy, kohlrabi, they like a higher pH. So sometimes if you are trying to grow something and it's just not successful, more than likely your pH is actually off, and it may be trying to try something else or try to work on fixing your soil to make it to the way you actually need it. I don't know if y'all are nerds. I'm a nerd. And this was an old magazine put out in the early 1900s by a nursery called Meehan's Nursery. And he called it Meehan's Monthly. Maybe I got a pointer. I don't know if I got a pointer or not. But I'm going to read this ad. And this was a neat little magazine. And it was kind of highlighting propagation type things, different plants that people were planting, in the early 1900s. But in the ad right there, I wanted to highlight, and if you ever find these, I'm missing quite a few. I have probably 25 or 30 of these, but it was put out for quite a few years. But on the left side, it says Gardner wanted, I need a thoroughly trained man for my place, one which is of the finest of the country, must be well posted in all branches. A greenhouse specialist will not answer. Should know something of trees, shrubs, and hardy perennials. Record and habits must be of the best. Now, here's my favorite part of the advertisement. He should be childless and content to remain so. Could you imagine that flying in an advertisement today for a gardener? This was published in a magazine that was published all across the U.S. in 1902. He should be childless and content to remain so. What a depressing life. All right. People always ask when they get a soil test back, why is nitrogen not on there? Because it leaches through so fast. It's always going to be recommended. For some people who are actually checking nitrogen, if you were growing corn, that's probably the number one crop that needs high nitrogen to actually form those kernels. We mostly check the macronutrients and just some of the micronutrients. So if you see these letters beside them, VHML, it'll say very high, high, medium, low, or S or D, sufficient and deficient. So the big ones that we mostly check for are the macronutrients, just to see if they're actually high, low, medium, which are phosphorus and potassium. Everything else is considered a micronutrient. So we'll just tell you if it's ample enough to grow whatever you're trying to grow. So kind of going back to this soil sample here, this one was an old one from 2009. And you can kind of see at the very bottom, it says phosphorus and potassium levels are very high or high. Therefore, additional applications of these nutrients are not recommended. So this soil spot where these people were trying to grow a vegetable garden was so fertile, they didn't need to actually add anything else to it. So just test the soil. If we were to go get a bag of fertilizer, and I'm going to assume most of y'all know what this is, it's going to have three numbers on the bag. The first one's always the nitrogen. The second one is the phosphorus, and the third one is the potassium. But that doesn't always mean if I get a bag of 10, 10, 10, that means 10% this, 10% that, 10% that. So like potassium is always available as K2O5, and nitrogen is usually available as N. So why do we use these macronutrients? The macronutrients are for three things. Nitrogen typically helps with leaf growth, helps with that dark green color. Phosphorus helps with the roots and basically the whole overall. Phosphorus also helps out with some of the disease stuff like potassium does. So they kind of play off of each other. Potassium helps plant with drought stress. Hopefully, you can kind of understand that some of these nutrients are already in our soil and we don't really need to be putting excess phosphorus and excess potassium down. I always get asked, are there toxic levels of these? There are. You can actually give a plant too much phosphorus, too much potassium. We have some strawberry growers in our county. One of the things that they worry about is boron. Boron, it can be toxic to strawberries, and you can actually go through and kill strawberries. Who would have ever thought about that? Because it's a micronutrient. I always get questions every year. My tomatoes are rotting at the bottom. That's blossom end rot. Every soil test that's come across my desk has had high amount of calcium. So blossom end rot is caused by a calcium deficiency. But all of our soils have enough calcium in them. So what causes it? The inability of the plant to take up the calcium that's there. It could be a pH is off. The calcium's there. The plant's just not able to get a hold of it. Another reason why we get blossom end rot and calcium deficiency is periods of drought. If the plant is forming that fruit and we go just a few days without water, it's not able to take up the calcium that's needed. Boom. Then we get a calcium deficiency. Magnesium also helps, or it shouldn't say macronutrients. Magnesium and sulfur. Sulfur helps with the taste of vegetables. I'm a garlic grower. We really like the taste of sulfur. Kind of going through, you can go through some other tests for some other micronutrients, but for the most part, all of these play off of each other. So the iron helps with the chlorophyll. And if you ever seen an iron deficient plant, The leaves are completely yellow except the veins are dark green. And we see it pretty common on vegetables. So people who are growing peppers, tomatoes, be a beautiful yellow leaf, but every single vein will be dark green. So I always think about pumping iron in the gym. My veins stick out. I don't work out, so that's kind of a joke. So if you see a plant with just all the green veins sticking out, it's an iron deficient plant. For the most part, all the rest of them for most vegetables are fine unless you're a strawberry grower, which is boron. I wanted to hit on some of these. We're seeing more people interested in organic type ways of amending their soil. So that could be organic nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and also lime already itself is organic. But this was just a small list of some of the ones that are available now and their fertility numbers. So we hear people talk about alfalfa meal. Blood meal itself is just straight nitrogen. So if you're wanting to use nitrogen in the garden for tomatoes or something like that, you can use blood meal. The only problem is sometimes blood meal can have a smell and draw animals in because it can smell like blood, it's dried blood. Bone meal has really high phosphorus in it. Also, bone meal has really high calcium, but we don't need the calcium already in our soil. If you're growing things that are bulbous, I use a lot of bone meal typically in my garlic. Compost is going to vary. It's going to depend on what's in it. Cottonseed meal, we don't see this a lot around here. If we were in West Tennessee toward Memphis, we would see more people selling cottonseed meal, which is basically the hulls. Green sand, bat guano is becoming more popular. Kelp, seaweed, they're all going to be different, but that was some of the main products there. And manure, each manure is completely different. Um, but all manure needs to be out of the animal at least 90 days if it's a crop above the soil. If it's a crop that touches the soil, the manure needs to be out of the animal at least 120 days. Now, that's the organic rules for applying manure to the garden. I get nervous when people say, I just use manure in my garden. I'm really picky about it, and I want it to sit out at least 6 months before I use it on my garden. Feather meal, fish emulsion, rock phosphate, and also soybean meal were some other organic options. Now, there are plenty. So I'm not saying now this one is the best one. Buy this Espoma, buy this Dr. Earth. These are all various brand names. So I don't try to highlight some brand name over another. But for the most part, that's what I wanted to hit on, Richard. And if y'all have any questions, you can hit me up. You can call my office. You can email me, especially if you're gardening and you've got diseases or bugs or some issue, you can send them to me.
Well, thank you, Lucas. Let's all give Lucas a Zoom type round of applause. You
Thank
may
you.
be able to manipulate your reaction button on the bottom, but I can never get to it in time. So,
I'm too slow.
um, at any point, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can go ahead. I'll get us started though. Um, Back before I took my master gardening class and back before I had really done much gardening, I was successful in killing off several blueberries and azaleas in my yard here in Franklin, Tennessee. I have a slightly high pH here, and so my blueberries never really had a chance. Now, in terms of the kind of gardens that we would have would be a lot of us grow vegetables, but mainly our chapter is about promoting the use of native plants in the landscape. And so when you think about the rhododendrons, azaleas, and even some trees like that that Quercus prenoides I was mentioning earlier, that dwarf Chinquapin
Yep.
oak, is found in nature in acidic soils and tend to be sandy soils as well, especially sandstone barrens, for
Yeah.
example, would be a place you might look for this particular tree. So if we're going to try to force that to grow here I'm in the central basin, the outer part of the central basin, where I've got a slightly high pH soil, to make it a lower pH, what would be the strategy for doing that?
I, one of the things that some growers are using is aluminum sulfate. And it just kind of depends. And people will say, well, how much? And I don't know. It kind of depends on how high your pH already is. Now, there are other things that you can use. And typically, I'm trying to think. I see the bag right now because it says something like makes hydrangeas blue. It may be, I think it's aluminum sulfate. I hope that's right. Because I've got bags of it where I bought it on sale one year and it's in my garage right now. But I think that's what, for the most part, people are using. But it's not a quick process changing
Right.
the pH.
So how successful would it be to use some pine fine products and some pine bark nuggets?
That's it's slow. So one question I get every year is I planted blueberries. I put pine needles all around them. They just never have been successful. Uh, a lot of the research from some of the universities. So I had a series of articles that I put in our local newspapers, and it was called Gardening Myths and Gardening Legends. And the number one was people who put pine needles around everything, and it only drops the pH about a tenth of a percent.
Right.
A lot of the pine bark, pine fines, and things like that. A lot of the nurseries, a lot of the trees that we see are grown in pine fines. It doesn't actually have a low pH.
So the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the best time to work on your pH was 2 years ago.
Yep, you got it right.
I never heard the second part of that story, but anyway. What other kind of questions do we have out there?
Make them easy.
Okay, making me what kind of easy questions do we have out there?
Uh, Lucas, I'm Kevin Key. I'm here in Nashville, but we have our home place in Smith County, not far from Wilson County, down there in the north, the west side of Smith County.
Yeah.
And I had some soil test run earlier this spring for hay, and it had the recommended nitrogen range between 60 and 180. Why was it so broad?
It's probably depending on what your grass was. And it depends on it's complicated. So there are nitrogen products that hay people use called DAP, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but each of those different types of ones will have different types of nitrogen in it for the most part. And each product can be different. It could be dependent on the availability of what's actually in the store at that time. Nitrogen, I have never seen a hay field put over too much nitrogen on, because for hay, we're going to be wanting excess green growth fast. That is a wide range. Most of the parts, I think mine were 80 to 120 that I saw on my hay pastures here. That is a big range that you have. You have an easier question?
I'll come back, let somebody else take their chunk.
Okay, well, while Kevin works on an easier question, in my case, I'm in a subdivision with the 1/3 acre lot, but I have a lot of construction debris that was easier to bury than to haul off. And so with these are mostly concrete products, and so those aren't helping out either in terms of my pH.
Yeah.
But anyway, whenever I run into one, I dig it up and remove it. But it's already leached out a lot of stuff into the soil, I'm sure.
I would say you said your pH is pretty high. It could have been lime depending on what the stones were.
Yeah. Well, the construction material is mostly a concrete product, and so
Okay.
that's going to have limestone in it
Yeah.
around here.
Yep.
And then we got limestone bedrock as well. So, you know.
I have quite a bit of bedrock rock outcrops on my property.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in hearing more about the wait time for the animal fertilizers. What's the variations there?
That was the rule set by the organic growers. So it's 90, when you say wait time, so if it's a crop that is touching the ground, it has to be out of the animal at least 120 days. And that the organic rules, it's OMRI, Organic Management Resource Index. I believe that's what it stands for. If it's a crop that's above it, that's not actually touching the manure, it only has to be out of the animal 90 days.
I see.
And that's because of Salmonella, E. coli, and other things like that. Can you burn a plant with hot manure? Yeah, you can. Yeah. And I hate to say, all manure is completely different. It's all based upon what it's fed. It's depending on the type of grass that it eats. There's a lot of variations in manure. It needs to be out of the animal, in my opinion, 6 months.
Yeah.
I'm leery about using fresh manure. I use sheep manure on everything, but it sits in a pile 6 or 7 months before we throw it out
Okay,
on our garlic beds.
great. Thank you.
Lucas, Mike had a question for you. He was wondering what to do if your soil is high in micronutrients.
There's nothing you can do.
Ugh,
That's it. And it depends. Sometimes subdivisions, they truck in topsoil, really good topsoil to kind of build the homes or whatever, or depending on the subdivision, they scrape away all the really good topsoil and sell it to somebody else down the street. So kind of depend on the situation. There's nothing you can actually plant that kind of pulls out micronutrients. Now we have mustards you can plant and pull out heavy metals that may be in the soil, but we don't have a lot of issues with that. Hemp growers a couple of years ago were really concerned about high heavy metals in soil, but they were going through planting because hemp will take up every bit of heavy metal in the soil, and sometimes it can deposit in the bud. So there's just some useless hemp knowledge. They were planting different types of biofumigant type plants, such as mustard, to pull out that metal, harvest it, take it off, and throw it somewhere else on the property. But for micronutrients, there's nothing you can do. I have never seen a plant with toxic levels of any fertility type, nutrient. So even though I know there are toxic levels, nitrogen will burn a plant up really good. I have never seen phosphorus, potassium, borons, iron, sulfur, zinc. Never seen anything, die from excess amounts of those. Yeah, I think hemp would be a good option for soil remediation sites. Hemp was really big 2 years ago, and it kind of fizzled out really quickly in our county.
Lucas, isn't boron necessary for clovers, for legumes?
Yeah, it's necessary for everything. And the only thing I worry about was strawberry people. You can get foliar analysis to see if your boron level's too high in the strawberry. But yeah, boron is needed for everything. I missed one question here in the chat.
Yeah, Patricia had a question. Do you want to read your question, Patricia?
I can.
Okay.
Once you apply aluminum sulfate to change acidity, how often would you need to reapply? Would this need to be a lifelong commitment? Yes. Soils are going to constantly try to revert back to what they once were. So it's not a one and done thing. Y'all remember the old Ronco oven? Set it and forget it. Soil is not like that. It's going to be a constant battle. So sometimes people will say my pH is 7.5. I want to grow blueberries. I'll say, please grow something else, because it's just, you're going to spend so much in money trying to change that pH each year. It's just going to be a constant battle. Is it going to be a battle you're going to lose? No, it's just going to be a battle you're going to do each year. So, and that depends on the pH to begin with.
So how effective is hollytone for use in lowering the pH?
It would be fine too. Hollies, we have a lot of Ilex opacas and a lot of the native hollies that like pH, have a low pH, and those seem to be kind of an understory type tree, these native hollies, and especially some of these deciduous type hollies. There are some beautiful deciduous hollies, but hollytone would do fine too.
Mhm.
I need to look up and see exactly what's in hollytone. It may be aluminum sulfate. I don't remember.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what's in it.
Yeah, I don't know either. I need to look that up. Is there any role for mixing in sand to clay to improve growth for drainage? So when you mix sand with clay and it hardens, what do you get? You get a brick. So I'm never a fan of mixing in sand in anything. I like to add organic matter, manure, leaf mold. Richard was talking about pine fines. Any type of organic matter is going to be better in the long run than adding sand. So a couple of years ago, I visited a gardener in Mount Juliet with his carrot beds, and he had added so much sand it wouldn't hold any water. And he said, well, what can I add back to this now? And I said, you're going to have to dig out the sand. I mean, it wouldn't hold anything. So if you're improving drainage, just add organic matter, whatever you can find. Yep. I may have seen that article about the mustards taking up the toxic metals from the soil. Thanks for sharing that. Does leaving the leaves to decompose help the soil? Yes, they do. And I always get not frustrated. We see everybody mow their lawn, then they take up all the clippings and then they throw them somewhere else. You can leave those clippings, they'll be fine. Maybe we've got all the questions.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have one. Lucas, you talked about organic matter and carbon uptake. Regenerative agriculture talks about increasing the carbon content of the soil to improve the soil. Is it possible to accurately measure the uptake of carbon in the soil year to year?
I am sure there is. Do I know of that way? No, I do not. So I don't. You're asking hard questions, Kevin. I'm sure there are ways to test it, but I don't know. Yeah, which native grasses make good pastures? If you're wanting just pastures for wildlife, little and big blue stem, yeah, I think that's andropogons. They are beautiful grasses, especially in the fall time. And the broom sedge, it has kind of a bad rap. So when we got rid of the broom sedge, what did we get rid of? We got rid of the bobwhite quail. So the bobwhite quail uses the broom sedge as an understory, but pasture people, nothing eats it. So we got rid of our hay fields. That's when our bobwhite, population started to decline. We have bobwhites on the back part of our property, and it's so cool to talk to them every night. But we have a thick stand of broom sedge. Also, panicums do well too, which are the switch grasses. And I think I think they changed the Latin name of one of the blue stems to Schizocarium. And I need to look that up because, these stinking plant taxonomists, they change the names every couple of years. Once I learn something, learn how to spell it, they change it the next year. Like Cornus florida, our native dogwood, it's not Cornus anymore. It's called Benthamidia, which is the new Latin name for dogwood. They just changed it a couple of years ago. So there's some useless Jeopardy knowledge, Richard.
Well, yeah, the two blue stems are now in separate genera. So it's always fun keeping up with the taxonomy reclassifications and deciding when the change is finally official and when it's in transition.
Linnaeus is rolling over in his grave right now.
But in addition to field use, I use a lot of those grasses as ornamentals in my yard. My air conditioning screening is Panicum virgatum, the switchgrass.
I love switchgrass.
I've got a little blue stem to accent my front. I've got yellowgrass. I'm blocking on what the genus and species is on that, but
we've got some sedges too that are native.
Yeah, the sedges work very well. I don't have any, but I know people that are very successful with using those, even for borders.
I don't have any advice on buffalo grass. I'm not sure on starting and establishing a buffalo grass lawn. I'm sure Linnaeus wishes he could see DNA in a microscope.
Well, on the plus side, the taxonomy is beginning to reflect the evolutionary relationships. And I think in the long run, that's a good thing. With the DNA analysis, a lot of genera that were not well understood have now we understand what's closely related to what. And so in the end, it should be okay. But I think taxonomy is never going to completely settle down.
No, I think you're right. And I just hate to learn something and it changes like the blue.
Well, when your high school botany teacher told you learn the scientific name, then it'll never change. They weren't really. That's like the math teacher saying, learn how to multiply. You can't carry a computer around in your pocket. So, Last call on the questions. You're muted, Donnie. I think Donnie's talking, but he's muted.
Okay, unmute. So I garden a hillside in Bellevue, and the soil is clay and terrible. And so I keep hauling up peat moss and compost. What else should I be adding as a top layer? I don't rake the leaves. I let them decay. What else should I be doing to that hillside?
That's probably fine. And you may back off on the peat moss. Usually compost would just be fine. And if you can find the leaf mold and things that the city has, it doesn't matter really what type of leaf. What are you growing? Is it just?
Oh, I have a woodland area that I do ferns and trilliums and ephemerals and, some of the understory plants. And then I've got a tiny little prairie lower, and I've got a rain garden as well and a water garden. But it's like little tiny bits of native gardens.
And the compost would be fine. I probably would not add a lot of the peat moss, but the compost would be fine. Most of the things that you mentioned, the trilliums and the ferns and things, will do fine in clay. I love trilliums, especially seeing them after they've been there for 15 or 20 years, looking at the size of clumps. We have some beautiful clumps of trilliums on our property. And like you were talking about the spring ephemerals, they'll be fixing to pop here pretty soon, and I can't wait.
I know, me neither. And toothwort is like the first to surface.
A lot of native wildfires are said to thrive in poor soil. What does poor soil translate to when we're looking at our soil test report? I can't say I have ever seen a soil test that come across my desk and said low, 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 low. I think for the most part, a lot of these things just thrive where they are or they die.
Well, of course, when we build a house, we alter the soil quite a bit, potentially around it, and especially in a packed subdivision. But the native plants did evolve to do well in the native soil that we have. But it's just in subdivisions, things are so altered that we don't really have native soil there anymore. We've got construction clay with a thin layer of topsoil that was spread by a bulldozer. So, Nick and Lillian have a question there at the bottom.
There was a lot of prairie drop seed and side notes grandma when my parents built their house in the 50s, and some others I don't recall. Would those be easier than buffalo grass there for a lawn? We hope to kill off the buffalo grass eventually. Is there anything we can do culturally to discourage the Bermuda? Bermuda is a beast in and of itself. Other than herbicides, that's about the only option for Bermuda. And I'm not real familiar with buffalo grass. I need to look that up. What genus is it in? I'm gonna look it up.
I don't know.
That's the second time it's come up. Oh, Bootalua. I'm not real familiar with buffalo grass. So Nick and Lillian, I've not answered any questions for y'all tonight.
They give tough questions.
There's no plant. I think maybe you're asking, is there a plant you can plant to compete with the Bermuda? And the answer is no. I can't think of one grass that will choke out Bermuda.
That's certainly been my experience. If you're not opposed to using glyphosate or a similar herbicide, you can reset the clock to 0 doing that. But when you try to remove it by hand, you're really just you're committing to a lifelong process, which some people choose, and I respect that. So I have Bermuda grass, that I can't get rid of because I haven't yet, sprayed my whole yard with an herbicide. But if herbicides, I think, have a place, but you have to use them carefully. And
Yep.
at least with glyphosate, it breaks down quicker than a lot of the other choices that are out there.
Buffalo grass is native to the high plains. It hardly grows. You only have to mow it a few times a year. I need a lawn, but my lawn is mostly chickweed and henbit right now, which is
Right.
fine. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah, if
I
you look
like-
at the native range of buffalo grass, it starts pretty much at the Mississippi River and goes westward. There are small individual counties in Virginia and Georgia that have it natively, but the USDA map, all the green is west of the Mississippi, just about.
Okay, good.
If
Now I
you-
don't feel so stupid.
Yeah. So if you need to know something about a plant, one option is to go to plants.usda.gov. It accepts common names and scientific names, and it will show you, if you zoom in twice, what the native range is county by county. So until you zoom in twice, if it's in one county in a state, the whole state gets colored green and misleads you into thinking it's common in that state. So one of the many tools you can bring to bear on plants and learning about them.
Grasses have always been a weak point of mine. Amanda, I'll ask an easy one. Even if there isn't time to amend the soil before planting, is it still okay to go ahead? Yeah, we have people getting soil tests right now, and it's mostly just to see where you're starting from. And even though you may still plant a vegetable garden in that spot right now, at least know what's there. I think it's beneficial to do it anytime you can get in the soil.
Well, when you learn all about grasses, Lucas, you could come back and give us a talk on native grasses. We would all love that.
That'd be fine. Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Lucas.
Luke.
Let's give Lucas another
Yay,
thank you.
Lucas.
And we can adjourn the meeting. If anybody has questions for me, I can hang around a little bit, but so let's consider the meeting part over. In fact, I'll officially do that by turning
Good
off
job,
the,
Lucas.
Thanks. I was real nervous.